Great. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. My name's Eliza Erickson. I'm an investment partner at Omidyar Network, where I work on... Actually, can we go back one slide? I manage our global investments in education technology, as well as the strategy around them, which are focused across the developing world, actually, in the global south. Omidyar Network, for those of you who don't know, was founded in 2004 by Pierre Omidyar, who's the co-founder of eBay. We are his primary philanthropic vehicle, and we invest both in for-profit companies for social impact as well as nonprofit grant making. In the education initiative, our mission is to unlock human potential through learning by catalyzing people, ideas, and systems so that every individual can contribute and thrive in what we know today is a changing and interdependent world. So we're excited to launch today a first-of-its-kind study on how EdTech can be scaled equitably to low and middle-income countries and to low and middle-income learners on a national level across the global south. So this is the title of the report, which should be in your hands or at the back. It's also available on our website, which is omidyar.com. It's just gone live, so you're the first to read it and receive it. So we can go to the next slide. Thanks. So here's our agenda for today. We only have 30 minutes, so excuse me while I whip through at 150 miles per hour the findings of the report, because I'd really like to drive to the discussion with some great panelists. After I summarize the insights, we're going to take a closer look at two of the case countries, which have very compelling but different journeys towards scaling of EdTech, the US and Indonesia. And we're very lucky to have two panelists from each of the countries who were there in the front row seat as the EdTech ecosystem evolved. Iman from Indonesia and Aaron from the US. So I will introduce them in a bit. So thanks for joining us, you guys. So we can go to the next, yes. So why are we so intrigued by education technology? Why is it interesting for us? And why, in particular, have we invested in it across the global south? You may know the statistic that 250 million learners around the world, children and youth, and some adults, are in school but not learning, not gaining the basic skills and competencies. And there was a recent report that the Brookings Institute published where we learned a new statistic, which is perhaps even more shocking, that it will take a century, 100 years, to close the education achievement gap between low and high income learners. So there's a massive disparity. So if we keep going at the pace we're going, it's going to take a century. And I hope you agree, but we believe at ON that that's far too long to wait. Next slide. So I think we're excited around EdTech because the global evidence has been increasing that a variety of tech-enabled interventions are not only effective and affordable, but have potential to really leapfrog current reality on the ground and close both that century-long gap and learning gaps between high and low-income learners. At ON, we like to call these strategies and solutions equitable EdTech, because they are designed with equity in mind. They are designed for a range of environments and a range of learners and a range of schools. So just to give a few examples of this concept, a recent review of over 130 impact evaluations on education in the developing world put at the top, in terms of impact on learning outcomes, two interventions. One is teaching at the right level, which I know we've talked about a lot at this conference. There's been a lot of publicity around. In a classic classroom, you can have 4 to 5 grade levels, right? And often as many as 3 grade levels behind, and the teacher is teaching the grade level curriculum. So someone who's 2 to 3 years behind is missing a whole nother year because they don't have the fundamentals to grasp those concepts. So the idea is surfaced of teaching at the right level, regardless of what classroom you live in. The second concept is around really specific pedagogical guidance for teachers. So often they're just given a curriculum. On Monday, you have to teach fractions. Shouldn't they know the best, most time-tested way to teach fractions, not just that they have to teach fractions. So those two concepts have become really compelling, and both have very affordable, scalable tech solutions. Particularly teaching at the right level through machine learning and AI has a really exciting, possibility to personalize lesson plans based on where the student is today. So one other example, particularly of the pedagogical intervention, is on the slide here. It comes from our case country of China, where Onion Math trained an active user base of 500,000 middle school math teachers to use their digital content in actually quite low-income third-tier cities in China with some exciting results. In Uruguay, the government scaled a platform for adaptive learning in math across the entire country's public school. It cost $1.50 US per student per year. It produced twice as many learning games for low-income students than high-income students, about 1 1/3 additional months of schooling in equivalent gains. So we're excited. These things are really designed for the context and the people we care about. However, what is much less clear is how you scale those solutions up, how you scale them across national systems, across learners. And so with that question in mind, we chose 4 countries. 3 of them are in the developing context. One is the US, that has done this at some level of success and really pulled out a framework of learnings and recommendations for other countries. So we can go to the next slide. So these are the 4 countries. We used a number of criteria that you can see up on the slide to choose them. Predominantly some level of scaled EdTech usage inside and outside schools from low-income to high-income students. So there's a fair amount of scale and impact already happening. So the 4 countries, again, are Chile, China, the US, and Indonesia. And in your reports, you can see much more. And really, in conducting the case studies, we wanted to learn, how did they reach the scale? What were the key tipping points? What were the key interventions that happened? And what could other countries learn about their journey? Next slide. So this graph shows kind of an adoption curve and a success curve. And what it really does show is that each of the countries is at a different stage, which is not good or bad. Basically, what we learned is there are 3 stages, at least, to the journey. One is EdTech access, which we know does not mean use, just access. Then effective usage and usage at scale. And then usage for transformational learning. And, each stage is different. What's interesting, the US is the farthest along. They're not all the way there, as we'll talk about in a moment. But actually, China and Indonesia have moved the fastest up the adoption curve, much faster than Chile or the US. So it's an interesting set of stories. You can go to the next slide. So the study, as I said, produced a framework, kind of a playbook for other countries to consider. What inputs have to be there for equitable scaling? And it sort of has 4 prongs. The first is local innovation. You need an EdTech entrepreneurial ecosystem of local products adapted to local language and local reality. You need to know you need to have some things to choose from. And the government and a range of players have a role in this. This doesn't just happen organically. In most of the countries, the government was involved, philanthropy was involved in sparking this ecosystem. Second, and this is the one everyone thinks of first and sometimes stops, is enabling infrastructure. So you have to connect the schools, you have to usually have some sort of mobile internet, infrastructure, think about hardware. The problem is a lot of countries just do that, right? They buy the laptops, connect the schools, and leave. And that almost never works. So it's important to have all 4 of these. So we'll go to the third. This is actually really critical. The US is quite a good example of this, and Chile as well. You need an EdTech policy at the federal level, at the national level, which really sort of drafts a vision for what you're trying to do, how tech will be used and for whom, and what's the package that comes with it. It needs to be durable enough legislation that it's going to survive politics. It also needs to come with funding. particularly equitable funding. So the lowest resource schools can access this funding for implementation. Chile did this particularly well, if you want to look at the Chilean case. We go to the next. And the final, which is unfortunately also often forgotten or less prioritized, is human capacity. And this is on the report. For those of you who are taking pictures, you're welcome to take pictures, but you don't need to almost take notes. It's all right there. So human capacity at every level of the system. You don't just do teacher training. You have to train district managers, leaders, so they're aligned in this vision. Because this is a huge thing you're asking. This is like a huge change management initiative. The tech is almost the least of it. So let's go to the next slide. So why would we look at the ecosystem? This word is used in lots of different places. I think it's because personally, we started by just supporting innovations, and we very quickly realized that was not enough. Because, they would get to sort of say even, some of them got to hundreds of thousands or millions of students, but there was not regular usage or impact. And so we decided to look at countries where there has been usage and impact, and what made the difference. And it was not just supporting innovation. There were very intentional multi-sector efforts, public, private, and training that brought this to life. So we needed to take a systems and ecosystems lens. Keep going. We thought it was really important, and you can hopefully hear it in my comments, but there are a couple of principles which we hold really dear when we work on EdTech, and also when we worked on this study. So hopefully it's obvious, we care a lot about equity. So that's why we talk about equitable EdTech and the role that EdTech can hopefully play in closing the gap for low-income learners. We're also deeply, deeply aware that tech is not a silver bullet, and we're only interested in supporting it where there's evidence. That is impact on learning, but also impact on closing that gap between low and high-income learners. So we're not supporting it everywhere. So God forbid, I'm not going to go through this whole slide, but this gives you a sense of the ecosystem framework that we've come up with. You can see each of the 4 factors in the framework, and then there's some actually quite helpful and specific sub-recommendations that come from the countries that we studied, what really is instrumental in bringing this all together and scaling equitably. So on the next slide, we just drill into one of them. This is policy that I was talking about before, the importance of a national EdTech policy that can survive politics, and that also comes with funding, with equity in mind. 2 other things that we've seen that are quite helpful in pushing EdTech innovation are really good, solid education reforms. So the idea of putting in place national learning standards, a national curriculum. This helps drive innovation in schools with some accountability towards, a new set of goals. So if you kind of have key reforms in place as well, that can incentivize use of EdTech. Keep going. Okay, now we're actually getting to the more exciting part where we're going to talk about the 2 cases with 2 great entrepreneurs. So we did a snapshot here of Indonesia, and then I'll do the US. As you can see, basically in the key takeaways slide, each country we looked at what a country did particularly well is a source of inspiration, what is a practice for replication, and where do they need to do some more work, to be honest, in terms of exploration. So in the case of Indonesia, and much like China as well, EdTech has scaled phenomenally rapidly through the mobile platform and mobile infrastructure, some really strong mobile payments systems, and a culture of social media and mobile use. And Iman will talk in a little bit about one of the largest EdTech platforms in Southeast Asia to illustrate that. There's also, as a result, a really strong entrepreneurial and sort of investment ecosystem around supporting these businesses that are scaling so rapidly. So you see venture capital, you see a real startup system there, which is quite interesting. Where I would say Indonesia needs to explore more is at the policy level for usage in schools. So, coming up with a set of guidelines, policy, and funding that would incentivize more use in schools. If we move to the US case, which some of you may know, but I learned a lot, actually, by reading the case study, so you may learn more too. The US has a really long history of federal policy and funding initiatives for EdTech connectivity, hardware, software, training, leadership management in public government schools. And unlike what you see in Asia and in Indonesia, it also has a thriving business sector that sells to government schools and makes their revenues based on usage in schools. So there's a lot of usage in schools. In addition to strong policy at the federal and state level, the US is really known for a strong non-governmental network of advocates, researchers, advisors on EdTech. So this really helps things keep moving, helps, sort of the government stay accountable around it as well. But the US also has work to do, particularly around measurement of impact of learning outcomes in EdTech. So there's still work to do there. So this next slide is, and I'm not going to read through it, is really about taking action. We wanted the report not to sit on a shelf, but to give some really practical recommendations to a set of actors in the ecosystem. So that this includes government, entrepreneurs and innovators, philanthropists and investors. And on the side here, you just have a pullout, an example in Chile of how the government really fulfilled some of these recommendations, playing an instrumental role in scaling EdTech across public schools with an equitable funding program, a set of education reforms, and also a seed capital program for EdTech startups. So that's like a really solid illustration. So final slide, I promise, before we start the discussion. So you have the reports. They should be around the room, so you can read them in hard copy. They're also live on our site at omidyar.com. We really would love your feedback and invite you to join the conversation, the debate. Is equitable EdTech possible? Does it have a role in your country? What role will you play? We would love to hear from you. So now we can shut off the slides and begin the conversation, which is more exciting. Maybe should we come in a little bit? Okay, you guys join me. I can't move. Great. Well, I'm really thrilled that these two are here, and they've come a long way, both of them, so thank you. We have Aaron Simmons and Iman Usman from the US and Indonesia. Aaron is former COO of Carnegie Learning, which is a high-growth learning math platform that you might be familiar with that has large contracts with public schools all over the US, is serving about 400,000 students at this point. A little secret is Erin is also an entrepreneur in residence at the Omidyar Network and was instrumental on this report, but I've asked her to give her perspective from seeing the EdTech ecosystem grow while she was at Carnegie. And then Iman Usman has joined us, who's a co-founder and chief product officer of Ruang Guru, which has had phenomenal growth. I was talking with a couple of people that you were at 3 million, 6 to 7 months ago, students, and now you're at 10 or 11 million. So one of the largest Southeast Asian EdTech platforms, which includes digital content, assessment, and teacher training. So we're gonna chat a little bit about what you thought of the study. What I thought we would start with, first, I would love a little background on both of you so people can kind of contextualize your comments. And then if you could start with your thought about the study. Did you find it resonant to your experience? What surprised you? What do you think we got right? Or where could we have dug a little deeper? So do you want to start, Iman?
So my name is Iman. I'm co-founder and chief of product and partnership of Ruang Guru. It's the largest education player in Indonesia. We're serving about 13 million students now. To give a context, there are about 50 million students, so we cover about 20% east of the total market. We develop a lot of things, ranging from learning management systems, learning video subscription, private tuition marketplace, corporate learning, adults learning, and so on and so forth. So I think talking about the report, I got a chance to read specifically on Indonesian report, I found the report actually very comprehensive yet concise. It's actually quite rare to find something comprehensive and concise at the same time, and I think it's a great snapshot of what Indonesia's education landscape looks like. As described in the report, basically it's a huge market, and there are more and more players. But I think when you look at more deeply into the market, it's quite interesting that many of them are actually very, very customer focused. And when I say customer focused, it refers to any platform that serves the students directly. I think it's kind of different from the US, where when we talk about the users, it's actually the schools or the teachers. But when we think about Indonesia, it's really, really, like student oriented, which is, good in some sense, because then the products are really designed in a way that meets the needs of the students. And in this case, it means that the students are the ones who are paying instead of schools and teachers. But then on the other hand, I think maybe it's not really covered in the report, but what I'm going to highlight is that because of that, then there are a lot of areas, there are a lot of verticals which I feel like is needed, but kind of overlooked. So for instance, there are not many players in the area of teacher training, there are not many players in the area of, let's say, education in the workplace, or vocational training, and so on and so forth. And those are some of the areas that I feel actually need some attention. Another point that I want to highlight as well, I think, despite the report covers quite a lot of things, but I think what is missing is sort of somewhat an assessment whether those products or services are effective and efficient enough to meet the needs of the users. So I think the report is designed in the eyes of the players instead of in the eyes of the users, and I'm actually intrigued to learn more whether those services, whether those players are actually meeting the needs of their targeted users. Another point, maybe my last comment before we discuss furthermore, is that I think one thing that is missing when we talk about infrastructure is thinking about payment. Particularly when we think about emerging markets where digital payment is not that established, credit card penetration is still very low. The main channel is bank transfer or even cash on delivery. Then thinking about that, then how it implicates the growth and the scale of edtech. For instance, in one of the things that we do is that even though we are an edtech player, but one of our biggest payment channel is actually convenience stores, right? Because most of our users are students. Students are the ones who are paying, and they don't have bank account, they don't have credit card, definitely. So they basically pay through convenience stores that are spread across the country, pay by cash, and then it's automatically updated on their app, right? So this thing, or maybe like when thinking about like internet penetration as well, when it's still very, very low actually when we go to remote areas, and thinking about what kind of adjustments that is needed. So for instance, we use USB on the go or SD card, or thinking about offline mode, or building specifically an offline first products. So I think that will be interesting to capture as well in the report. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you want to go ahead, Erin?
Great. So I think what's most exciting for me about the report is that we so often in the field of education technology look at quite transactional relationships in the ecosystem. So for example, we'll look at the buy and sell relationship, or the user and teacher relationship. But I think between looking at the ecosystem model, what you see is really the dynamics across the ecosystem, which is particularly relevant for the United States. So the real power of building the ecosystem over the 30 to 40-year period was that parts of these ecosystem components worked across. So for example, in building the infrastructure, we saw that human capacity element that Eliza talked about relative to NGO organizations building real upstream capacity at the same time as the federal government was starting to create programmatic funding and vision around those components. So looking at this ecosystem model, I think, provides a real dynamism around the capacity of the system. I think, like Iman, he mentioned the user missing a bit, and I think this is actually something that we find is missing a bit globally as we think about edtech and edtech scale. And for me, it comes back a little bit to how we think about research also. So research in particular, platforms that demonstrate and communicate product efficacy. Of all the cases we studied, of all the countries we studied, none, and inclusive of the US, have really figured this component out. And that's not to say that there isn't phenomenal research in the ecosystem. There is, but I don't think we've quite unlocked or figured out how the system can take that up and use it effectively.
Yeah, if you talk to most principals in the US, I mean, the dizzying array of sales pitches they get from vendors, and there's even in a mature market, very little ways to distinguish, certainly based on quality or efficacy. It's, maybe on price or, certain deals, subscriptions, et cetera, they're getting discounts, but so that's something that really needs to be worked on more and is not always in the business's interest. So figuring out who the guardian is of efficacy over the long term is really important. I wanted to see what you thought each of your countries did particularly well. If you saw the case studies where they really stood out, and this could be in the private or public sector for those of them in the room who want to take just sort of one takeaway, one lesson from your particular context, and anyone can start.
I think there are a couple of things. The first one, I think, despite it's still a relatively young market, but I think Indonesian players have a relatively healthier business model because again, they're very user-centric, they're very customer-focused. So that's they're basically developing a product where there is actually a buyer for it. And if you look at specifically more into the market, many of them are not venture-backed. So many of them are still bootstrapping. That means that they need to figure out the right business model. And I think that's a case where we don't really see in many markets, particularly other big markets, where people are very obsessed with growth and forget about the sustainability of the product that they are developing, right? Second thing, talking about education policy and talking about how government is involved in the process, what I'm seeing is that the government is not that involved, and as a player, I think it's good for now, because sometimes when they're too involved and they're too, regulate everything, it hinders the progress of many innovators, right? And what we've seen is that, to give a bit of context, Indonesia is very decentralized. So the national government does not, mandate anything. Everything is given to, the authority is given to the city and regency level. So it gives a little bit of advantage for us as a local player where we can basically really know the people, really know the know-how, really know how to navigate around. And because it's decentralized, so it's easier to make the decision because we don't really have to go to, really, really top people to make things going, right? So I think that's one of the things that that they're doing particularly well. And I think the third one is just a very supportive ecosystem where a lot of recent policies kind of support the growth of EdTech. For instance, in 2015, the government introduced computer-based national examinations. I think right now is the largest computer-based standardized exams in the country. I mean, it's, tons of millions of people are taking the exams every single year, right? And that helps the growth of the EdTech because there are use cases actually, finally, where technology is being used in the classrooms. And it helps us to promote our products as well.
Definitely.
And it strikes me in reflecting on a comment that both Indonesia and China have scaled especially quickly. And I think it's no accident that that's really as a result of the consumer being at the center and a business model that relies on a business-to-consumer sale. And in the US, I think what we've done particularly well is access and infrastructure within systems of schools. But I think that is a slower process and takes much more time and demands much more energy from the system writ large. And I think the success here is that in US schools, more than 98% are actually digital learning ready. About half of students in elementary and middle school are using technology for a core learning subject. There's more than 14 million devices in schools for a population of just about 55 million students K through 12. So penetration achieved by that human capacity segment in combination with the federal government and then an EdTech entrepreneurial ecosystem that was ready really combined for active success in the US towards access and infrastructure in schools.
Great. Well, I wanted to see if we could take one or two questions. We have 2 minutes, 1 minute. So let's take one round. So let's see, hands up. Yep. Okay, can we go over here?
Hi, thank you for this very interesting presentation. I wonder about the role of the parents. So, you know, parents can be very important in how children interact with the technology, and also, I think without sort of bringing up parents along the curve, you know, we are really stifling the potential of EdTech. So how do you see the role of parents?
Hi.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
My name is Kareem from Excel Skills. We teach coding online with social impact, so we help people find careers through coding. Focused on developing countries, of course. So my question is, the biggest challenge in scaling education or scaling EdTech is the right pricing for these people, because people don't have the means to pay. So what's your experience, or how did you tackle that problem?
Let's take one more. Yeah, go ahead. Or you had one too, so two more. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks for the panel. My question is about the equity of access, because you mentioned, for example, in the US, 14 million devices. Well, what about the majority who don't have the devices? And what about within that, the segment at the the lower income section of the population for whom parents struggle financially day to day, affording books, lunch, etc. How are they going to come up with the extra few $100 for their kids to have access to these devices? And similarly, in Indonesia, if the parents have to pay on behalf of the children, what does this do to the equitable access to this technology, and how could these challenges be overcome?
Take the last one here.
Hi, good morning. My name is Toyosi Akirele. I come from Nigeria. I'm the founder of PassNowNow.com, which is the most used mobile learning platform in Nigeria. I'm particularly concerned about low-quality teachers and the role of teachers in, accelerating tech adoption in a country like Nigeria, where, you have huge inequalities. Lagos is the most populous city in the whole of Africa, and then you go up to the northeast, where children are so poor that terrorism has now taken over the system. What I find with the way we're implementing EdTech in my country is there's so much focus on the students, and so the teachers feel left behind. How have you been able to tackle that in the course of your own work? And how do you think that we can stimulate the interest of teachers a lot more? Because we need them. If you give technology to children and the teachers don't feel interested, they'll frustrate the process, and it makes it difficult for the children to learn using these new deep transformational technologies.
Great. Okay. I've got one more. One more. Yes. Last one. Thank you.
My name is Bola Lawal. I'm also from Nigeria. Run Scholarx.com, Scholarx.co. It's a platform that helps. We work in the intersection of finance and education. We help connect students with funding opportunities to get education. My question is simple about sponsored access. What are your thoughts on sponsored access, and is this something that can be done at a much larger scale? So, for example, you have a technology, you want to get into the reach of people that can't afford it, and so you work with, say, Vodacom in the country, but you want to go extend it in another country. So how are you going to be able to, is it sustainable, is it scalable, or what can you get around that? Thank you.
Great questions. Okay. So does anyone feel passionately about, we have the role of parents, the right pricing for lower income consumers, how equitable actually is it, given cost of devices, et cetera, low quality teachers and what role EdTech has to play, and sponsored access. Yeah.
I'll take on teachers and, to an extent, parents to get us started.
Oh, and parents, yes, sorry.
So I think while access is just the first step, and equitable access isn't necessarily something that we have achieved, it's not an end state, I don't think. I think what's next, particularly in the US and in places that have achieved access, is a different kind of infrastructure, which I'm thinking about as a practice infrastructure. So how do you build the processes and the practices around the system that really enable us to build and sustain this at scale for teachers, for parents, for users? And that means starting to really redesign with the user at the center. So I think access is a first step. It gets ubiquitous use, but it doesn't actually mean impact. and parents and users and the systems around those critical components of instruction and teaching and learning, I think that's where we've got to go next.
I think I'll try to answer some of the questions combined very briefly, given the time. First, about the role of the parents, I think we acknowledge that parents are very, very influential in the learning of the kid. And what we do is that how then we provide accountability to the parents about how the kids are learning and what kind of improvements that they are doing. And in doing that, we need to be very careful by understanding, how the parents are also behaving. So, for instance, given the parents are not digital, fluent, then we basically develop a report by just sending a WhatsApp report regularly. So it's an automatic, we use a WhatsApp API to send report to parents so they have a better accountability and they can provide feedback instead of actually just building another app or building another system that parents might not understand how to use it, right? So that's one example. Another example on pricing, so understanding that, even though it's a growing market in Indonesia, the GDP is increasingly good, but many are still not familiar with this concept, with learning with technology. So that is why we price it in a way that is affordable for a lot of people. So we only price about 1/10 or even 1/13 of what students are typically paying in offline tuition context. And not only making it affordable, but also we're thinking about what are the process for them to pay. So payment enabler, or maybe thinking about installments, maybe thinking about subsidies, like you mentioned before. So that's some of the things that we do. And in doing that, we partner a lot with a lot of different organizations and governments as well. Atlassian and DFAT is here. We're working with them as well in basically subsidizing and thinking about the model that can reach out to the disadvantaged community by by basically developing certain concepts and bringing different parties together so that they can also contribute in the system.
I was going to say one thing about teachers, and if anyone, chair's prerogative. This idea that I mentioned in the presentation around really very specific guidance to teachers to solve what we like to call the Monday morning problem. So what are you going to do on Monday morning when you're sitting in front of the classroom? Hopefully, millions of teachers around the world are teaching fractions Monday morning. So why can't you have access to the best way to teach fractions? Why do you have to invent it on Sunday night? So this idea of lesson plans that live on top of a curriculum, that are very modular, can be digitally delivered straight to a mobile. We've seen that in Brazil, we've seen it in Africa with our investment in Bridge International Academies, where those lesson plans can be pushed directly to mobile or tablets, and we find the teachers love it. And really become way more engaged in it because it's helping them. It's meeting their day-to-day problems and pain points. So I think that is a very exciting way to kind of meet the teacher where they are and both honor their role but support them. I don't know if anyone else has any teacher comments. And then sponsored access to EdTech. Do you work with anything like that in Indonesia?
Yeah. I mean, we work with a lot of philanthropy organizations and also government actually, thinking about how then we subsidize some of our products and services to benefit those who are disadvantaged and those who are at risk. And I think when we think about that, it's not just about financial subsidies, but also thinking about what kind of adjustment that is needed. So, for instance, when we serve youth at risk who might not be, always connected with internet, and thinking about how can we bring that offline, or maybe thinking about some content adjustment, thinking about what also they need, so because they're not maybe 100% academically focused, so thinking as well about how can we make them also able to prepare for jobs and able to get jobs after they finish schools and things like that. Yeah.
Interesting. Great. Well, I think we're over, so I think we're going to stop there. But take a report on your way out. Check it out on the website. Thank you much for coming, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.